Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I am William Welburn. I'm Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion here at Marquette University. I'm delighted to see you all here this afternoon for our panel discussion, sort of based in part, at least, focusing on the poem by Langston Hughes, A Dream Deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? This short poem about equality, citizenship, and our national consciousness seems to have a special resonance today. We are 50 years out from those tumultuous days of 1963 and 1964 when we saw the civil rights movement turn into government policy and law, when thousands of college students headed south to register voters and stride toward freedom only to confront the reality of prejudice and resistance to change, of Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party attempting to get seated at the 1964 Democratic Convention. 1964 was a pretty amazing year. The idea of a dream was substantially challenged by a more assertive posture by veteran civil rights workers and a new generation of activists. This afternoon, we are really fortunate to have 4 of our faculty together in the same room to have conversation over the meaning of dream deferred, as it appeared over 60 years ago, and as we continue to contemplate its context. Our 4 presenters are Heather Hathaway, Associate Professor of English, Andrew Kahrl, Assistant Professor of History, Bryan Massingale, Professor of Theology, and Grant Silva, Assistant Professor of Philosophy. Each will talk briefly before we get into some discussion that we hope you all will join in with. So I think we'll start with Dr. Hathaway.
I'm going to have to use the podium because I have technological aids, which is very unusual for me. But I hope this will be less formal than that. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is an important date to remember, and I want to begin my presentation. I should have it up there, but I'm not that technologically coordinated. I want to begin my presentation with a quote from Martin Luther King from Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Quote, "We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." That notion of mutuality is something I want to keep as sort of an umbrella over my comments today. So, as William said, the Dean of the Library asked us to consider what have happened to King's dreams. Have they been deferred 50 years after the March on Washington? And I actually will contextualize my comments by contrasting the 1963 march as I've come to know it through reading a documentary, because I was in utero then, with my presence at the 2013 celebration. I happened to be in Washington. It was heaven sent, and my son and his dad and I went to the mall, and it was kind of surreal when you think about these issues all the time and then you're in the presence of this. It was very odd because a lot of the people who were there were people like me, of my economic class, not necessarily of my race, a lot of immigrants visiting Washington, a lot of tourists. For those of you who know Washington, the reflecting pools were filled up, but then after that it really depopulated. It was raining. We couldn't see the screens very well because they did not have it appropriately set up for us if you were further back. And I felt like it was it made me sad. I know it was celebratory, but it made me sad because what we were doing was commemorating a historical event, not really protesting injustice. And so it was kind of a nice party, but in my view, the issues that framed that original march have not changed much. And I regret that the people who really need representation and justice in this country didn't even think about going to the party on the Mall. So when I think of what has happened to these dreams, and thank you, William, for reading the poem as the English professor on the panel. I was prepared to do that, but now I don't have to. Langston Hughes, 1925, brilliant poet. I think that, you know, answering that question is obviously complex, and we're all probably going to give slightly different answers, partly because it depends on what dream of kings you're talking about, right? He had many. Certainly the speech that he gave on the March of Washington articulates several, but in all of his writings, as Father Massingale knows far better than I, because he teaches a course on Martin Luther King, dreams permeate his fights for racial justice. And so if I look at that right now, I think, well, okay, do we have more equality? And of course, most generally, those who believe we live in a post-racial society, as they keep telling us, say yes, we have a second-term African-American president and a first family. Awesome, problem solved. We have, as you travel along Washington's beautiful Mall area, a monument to Martin Luther King. Very striking for those of you who haven't gone. Students, tell your parents it's an assignment if they can figure out a way to get you there. Beautiful monument, a little marginalized, I'll say, geographically, but at least it's there. Not as marginalized as the Japanese internment monument, which is what I'm interested in too. And of course, I think most importantly, we have the opening of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. It's opening this year, which looks to be really great for me in lots of ways. There'll be problems, but it's a really rich collection. And they had various small exhibits up when we were down there. But the problem with all these things, in my mind, is that they're symbols that suggest progress. And all of us know that a symbol represents a reality, but it isn't that reality. And so my question is really, what's happened? What are the realities that we now face? I'd like to propose that Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, also celebrating its 50th anniversary, has really become instead, as Morris Dees, who's the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, describes it, a war on the poor. And moreover, I'd like to suggest that poverty and race are so indelibly linked, and very particularly in this city itself, that we have to wage a battle against both at once. Class, you know, racism was one sort of, historians forgive me, monolithic fight that we were fighting in 1963. You know, class divisions in minority communities have certainly changed over time. The Obamas being an example, and all the people who went to her birthday party at the White House, all the very wealthy people. But fundamentally, not a lot has changed in other ways. So let's look at some of the realities that we face if they show up. Ooh, ooh. Techie guy? Oh, there he is, good, okay. Okay, reality one. A Kaiser Family Foundation poll in 2012 showed that in every state in the nation with a substantial black population, the percentage of African Americans living in poverty more than doubles that of whites. And I'm not talking about other people of color today, I'm sticking specifically to African American culture, but you can see the statistics there as well. There's actually, what do you do to make it go? There's another page. Where did he leave? He left. I better not touch things because it's going to screw up. But what it does is tell you that the next, oh, that's a good idea. There you go, Janice. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's why I'm Dean.
That's it. That's it. That's how you get the big bucks. I know. I love that. So as you can see, African American poverty almost more than doubles in every single state where there's a substantial black population. Reality 2, in Wisconsin, the ratio of impoverished blacks to whites is 4-1. Reality 3, 69.4% of African American Wisconsinites live in Milwaukee County. So 30% are scattered around the state somewhere, most of whom are in Madison, I can tell you. But we have a very concentrated African American population in this state. Reality 4, Milwaukee, the city itself, remains nearly as segregated as it did in 1963. And if you look at the grid, so we have integrated blocks, which simply means that there were representations of 2 or more races living on these. This is from a UWM 2012 study also, I think. And for those of you who need a marker, so 43, you see where 43 is running, 94, and the dotted lines are Milwaukee itself. Then you start to hit burbs and things. So obviously, the concentration of race in this country is limited to a very small, this city is limited to a very small area. Within this reality 5, within this highly segregated space, the rate of African American male incarceration is the highest in the United States. That's what we get to be known for. In fact, Wisconsin's rate is 32% higher than the second worst ranking state, which is Oklahoma, according to the US Census of 2010. Over half of African American men in their 30s and half of men in their early 40s have been incarcerated in our state correctional facilities. Most importantly, fully 1/3 of these imprisoned since 1990 have been arrested for non-violent offenses, like driving without a license. Okay? Reality 5, 2/3 of these men live in 6 of the poorest per capita zip codes in the city, areas that have seen dramatic job losses and foreclosure actions due to the economic recession, as well as the movement of industry out of urban centers. When released, these ex-offenders return from prison to these zones and find no jobs available. A 2010 study by UWM showed that in these 6 zip codes, for every 25 people seeking employment, 1 full-time job existed. I mean, the statistics are staggering. My point in showing this is that racial discrimination and poverty, 2 of Martin Luther King Jr.'s primary concerns, remain indelibly linked in Milwaukee especially. If you need a car to get to a job and you get stopped because you don't have a license and you lose the job, what do? You get trapped, right? In a space, in a psychological space, many different sort of iterations of that concept. I also am struck as I'm teaching a course on American modernism and modernity, and I'm trying to teach the students about the Gilded Age and the discrepancy between the haves and have-nots. And I'm putting together this lecture a couple nights ago, and I thought, wow, it is so similar to where we are right now, where 1%, the top 1%, an Oxfam study showed, of the world's wealthy have 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. I mean, Rockefellers, Carnegies, US Steel, and the rest of us, right? I mean, this is the Gilded Age in terms of that discrepancy. The disparity is so extreme that the World Economic Forum identified income equality as one of the largest global threats facing us in 2014, in addition to various other things that we hear all the time. But income equality is not something that's on the news every night like global warming is. So my call today is really to sort of ask that we rededicate ourselves to Dr. King's dream of economic justice. Economic justice and racial justice are not separable. He said in 63, I think, America has, quote, the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will, unquote. And I think we're still facing that. So. Ooh, hope I was supposed to do that.
I think you may be the only one with PowerPoint. So, Andrew, Kahrl.
Hi, thank you for, can everyone hear me? Thank you for having me here. This is a real honor to be a part of this panel discussion today. In my African-American history course, I often teach this book by C. Vann Woodward called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And Woodward traces the history of segregation as a practice and also begins to unpack the logic of segregation. Woodward's thesis was that segregation was not the result of some natural animosity between whites and blacks, nor was there anything inevitable about it, nor did it immediately follow the end of slavery. Rather, he shows that the disfranchising and segregating laws that began to take hold in the late 19th and early 20th century America were really part of a determined effort to wipe out the considerable progress that had been made by African Americans during and even after Reconstruction. And more importantly, he shows how segregation really fundamentally aimed to prevent poor whites and blacks from ever joining together to topple the Southern oligarchy that oppressed them both. In short, segregation was a political strategy employed by the upper class to keep the Southern masses divided against each other and to keep Southern labor cheap. And it worked remarkably well. Woodward also really shows through this book that has, even despite having been published well over a half century ago, it's still being taught in college classes. He shows how really the possibility of an interracial class-based alliance was very much a possibility at this moment in American history. He does so by way of tracing the history of this kind of often forgotten populist movement that took shape in the late 19th century South, which aimed at sort of forging a pragmatic alliance between white and black farmers that was exemplified by political figures like Tom Watson, who would implore white audiences to recognize that they, namely African Americans, are in the ditch just like we are, and would say things such as, "You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arc of financial despotism that enslaves you both." Now, the populist movement, as Woodward showed, ultimately collapsed due to a relentless assault from the ruling white elite who really used racism as a tool, working to get poor whites to ultimately identify themselves as white people, not poor people, and as white people tried to get them to sort of fear and despise African Americans, to see them as the source of their own suffering. Martin Luther King really understood what segregation was and what it wasn't. He knew that segregation was not meant to keep the races separated. That was sort of a symptom of it. That ultimately, it was meant to simultaneously exploit blacks economically and prevent whites from harboring any sympathy or sense of mutuality, as Heather Hathaway alluded to a moment ago. And it worked, in short, to impoverish both whites and blacks. Race was a tool of labor control. And Martin Luther King also knew his history. He called Woodward's book the historical Bible of the civil rights movement. He referenced Woodward's thesis to audiences often, perhaps most famously in a speech that he gave during the March from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, when he said, quote, if it may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them that the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores, on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children, too, learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. Martin Luther King also understood the nature of the forces aligned against black Americans at that moment when they marched on Washington. It was during these years that we began to see this sort of conservative counter-revolution gathering steam, taking the shape of political figures like Barry Goldwater, who were really sort of laying the groundwork for a full-scale assault on working Americans, white and black, that would sort of come to full fruition in the 1980s. And like other political coalitions throughout history, it consisted of diverse elements: libertarians, cultural traditionalists, the business community, and militant anti-communists. In a sense, the only glue that kind of held this new right together during its early formative years was that they were all opposed to the civil rights movement. It's kind of a forgotten chapter in the sort of rise of modern conservatism, one that they're often very keen on sort of shunting to the side. In a sense, sort of states' rights, property rights, the rights of employers, all of these arguments became sort of core features of modern conservatism were really inseparable and at times really indistinguishable from the arguments against the civil rights movement. And for King and for the leaders of the March on Washington, it was really at its core, again, and it bears repeating that this was, as the title implied, a March on Washington for jobs and freedom, that this was fundamentally sort of seeking to forge an alliance between African Americans and labor, and to create a movement that was strong enough not only to overcome the forces of bigotry and hate, but also those who profited from bigotry and hate. Speaking to an audience of union workers on the eve of the March on Washington, King said, quote, "The forces that are anti-Negro are by and large anti-labor. And with the coming together of the powerful influence of labor and all people of goodwill in the struggle for freedom and human dignity, I can assure you that we will have a powerful instrument." As Will Jones, who you'll hear later on this evening, details in his fascinating study, this really, the March on Washington was led by and conceived by trade unionists, and particular A. Philip Randolph. Many of the people in the audience that day were members of trade unions. Hundreds of buses came in from northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia, big union cities, and really the largest delegation, if you could call anyone that day, were labor. The lead organizer of the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin, hoped that it would really reinvigorate this alliance between civil rights and labor that had really been torn apart during the previous decade of Cold War anti-communist hysteria that had kind of sent the NAACP into retreat and had really kind of almost sort of shifted the ground on which the civil rights movement was being fought. And he really sort of hoped that this would sort of help empower both of these groups to kind of launch a coordinated attack on shared enemies, shared obstacles. And it's important to sort of look at the time period in which the March on Washington took place, this period known as the sort of post-war America. By every measure, African Americans were losing ground relative to whites during this time period that is oftentimes called this sort of age of affluence, both in income, rates of employment, jobs held, and perhaps sort of most importantly, wealth accumulated. Particularly, this was felt in the labor. The evisceration of unions in the decade prior to the March on Washington had particularly negative effects on black workers. The city of Detroit shed 140,000 jobs between 1947 and 1963. And really, the nation was in the early stages of this process we've come to know as deindustrialization. And as African Americans were moving into northern cities during these years, the jobs that they were coming in search of were evaporating. This second wave of the Great Migration, first came in response to the collapse of sharecropping due to mechanization in the South. And when they came into these northern cities, they were coming really at this moment when whites were spilling out into the suburbs and industry was following them. And in a sense, sort of, the Chicago Urban League perhaps captured this irony best when they said that, quote, "He may be winning the right to get a job just at the time when the job itself is disappearing." I often sort of tell my students that historically African Americans can be, especially when it comes to the economy, can be seen as sort of the miner's canary. Oftentimes, the sort of problems that are inflicting at black communities are soon to be traveling into others. We saw this perhaps most recently with the mortgage crisis and how this was really, many of the effects of the housing bubble were being felt first within African American communities long before they spread out to and sort of crippled the American economy as a whole. And so too in the 1960s, that it wasn't really long before the pain that was being felt in Black America was also being felt by working class white Americans. This was devastating for working white families, but it was really perfect for those who were seeking to stir up racial animosities and prevent the sort of interracial coalition that King dreamed of. It was kind of fertile ground for the message being preached by the far right at that time, that civil rights for blacks was a loss of rights for them, that African Americans were seeking to take something from them, their job, the value of their home, their tax dollars. And in fact, I think in assessing the legacy of March on Washington, we need to recognize just, in a sense, just how successful they were in rolling back many of the more radical aims that brought so many people to Washington that summer. It's important to note that the Civil Rights Movement was an unqualified victory for middle-class African Americans. We saw profound advances in the workplace, in politics, in housing markets, in popular culture, all of which have been dramatic and cannot be ignored. But the movement, and King in particular, were not seeking to simply lift a select few out of poverty. This was not about providing or for opening doors of opportunity to some while leaving the system that created and perpetuated poverty for the rest fully intact. King really spent much of his last years fighting these sort of two fronts within Black America, against those who simply wanted Black power and who saw no use in class-based coalitions, and also against this increasingly apathetic middle class who seemed content to turn their backs on those who had been left behind. He oftentimes called out those who were deluded into thinking that their own success meant that all fellow blacks could enjoy it as well. To those who, as he put it, quote, floated or swam out of the backwaters of poverty, but had forgotten the stench of those black backwaters. So if we're looking at the March on Washington as those at the time understood it, as a struggle to transform the nation's economic structure and to break down the barriers that kept the white and black poor divided and blind to their shared interests, then in many respects it failed. We see this in the numbers, the decline of organized labor in the U.S. since the March on Washington, from 1/3 of the U.S. workforce to less than 7% today. And really that decline of organized labor in America has paralleled and is very closely related to the rise of income inequality. During those very same decades, wage inequality in the private sector increased by more than 40%. It's also worth sort of thinking back to some of the sort of lessons from the past and the ways in which the sort of anti-populist movement that ushered in the age of Jim Crow and some of the race-baiting tactics that we see today are very strikingly similar. Both sought to prevent interracial class coalitions by playing to racist fears and anxieties. We're well attuned to those times. Both used racism as a vehicle for implementing economic policies that favor the wealthy and would not on their own gain widespread support. The supply-side economics that were implemented during the 1980s would not have gained this type of support it did from the, quote, Reagan Democrats, were it not for that toxic additive of racism. During these years, whites watched as blue-collar jobs disappeared, wages stagnated, and their own taxes increased to offset the massive tax cuts for the wealthy. In return, though, they received a steady dose of racial animus. It was the mythical welfare queen who was the cause of their suffering. It was the crack addict or the Willie Horton who they should fear and despise. It's no coincidence that in America today, some of the most racist parts of this country are also some of the poorest. There was a recent study done by a Harvard PhD candidate in economics who tried to quantify racial animus in different parts of the U.S. through looking at Google searches. And the states that ranked highest were West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, a place I know well, and Southern Mississippi. Oh, and also upstate New York. Even more dispiriting is that with the exception of Mississippi, many of these places were once fairly progressive. But as the economy went south and jobs disappeared, this sort of visceral racism really took hold. In a sense, many poor whites in America are still feeding on Jim Crow. Now, I cite this study not as evidence that these are the ways we can begin to that these are the types of places where racism is most prevalent today, or really how we can sort of identify it. One of the problems I would say even with studies like this is that it tends to sort of equate racism with hatred, when in fact much of what is racist in America today is perpetuated by institutions and is the result of structural barriers. This narrow definition of racism is really, in a sense, another achievement of that conservative counter-revolution against civil rights. If racism is simply hate, then to prove racial discrimination, you must prove racial malice, ill intent. Conversely, any acknowledgement of race today is inherently suspect. We see this most prominently in the highest court of the land, where in the decision that put severe limitations on the integration of public schools, the Chief Justice John Roberts said, quote, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. If you simply ignore it, it'll go away." Many self-described sort of racial liberals often fall into this trap of sort of equating racism with hateful thoughts and actions. In my class, sometimes I'll ask students to picture in their minds what a racist in America today looks like and describe him or her to me. And they invariably describe someone who drives a pickup truck with a Confederate flag in the back, a Southern sheriff, maybe a hooded Klansman. Never did they describe the banker who's pushing subprime loans in inner-city black neighborhoods, or the corporate executive in the private prison industry who profits so much off the mass incarceration of black males. The movement that King has come to embody sought to change how we as Americans understood racial oppression and how we could hope to overcome it. And in that respect, much work remains to be done. So I guess in answer to this sort of question that was posed to all of us, is the dream deferred? I would say that if we're talking about some of the economic issues that stood at the heart of the March on Washington, the dream has not just been deferred, it's very nearly been revoked. And the sooner we recognize that, the closer we'll become to actually sort of dealing with the weight of the past and the challenges of the future. So, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Bryan, would you like to continue this discussion?
Can you all hear me? And is this good? All right, great. Two brief points are going to frame my remarks. The first is to have us have a more complex and less romantic idea of what the civil rights movement was all about. And then the second, to address the role of faith, both in the movement, but also in what needs to happen going forward. And I guess being a professor of theology, you would expect me to talk about faith, so I'm not going to disappoint you. As I tell my students in my class, we imprisoned the civil rights movement and the March on Washington into a noble but narrow struggle for integration and legal equality. We see it as an effort to eradicate racial apartheid and to ensure equal opportunity. We basically see it as a sentimental, romantic dream of little black boys and little black girls joining hands with little white girls and little white boys and seeing this kind of kumbaya moment or whatever, we shall overcome, we're linking arms, and it's really wonderful and sentimental. We saw all kinds of images of that yesterday because it makes us feel really, really good. But the goal of the civil rights movement was always broader and deeper than that, even if it wasn't always consciously adverted to for PR reasons. At the at the founding convention of the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King formulated the goal of the civil rights movement as, quote, to redeem the soul of America. From the beginning, the civil rights movement recognized that there needed to be a profound reconstruction, a systemic transformation of U.S. life. This was not empty, pious rhetoric of a Baptist preacher. The soul of America needed to be redeemed. And that focus, as we've seen so far, carried through in the March on Washington, which was indeed a march for jobs and freedom, jobs and freedom. Because as Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin articulated on the eve of the march, they said, integration in the fields of education, housing, transportation, and public accommodations will be of limited extent and duration, so long as fundamental economic inequality along racial lines persists. From the beginning, we see a realization of the overlapping, intertwined, interlocking, mutually reinforcing threats of poverty and racism. This wasn't just a goal for a sentimental photo op. It was not just a goal to have integrated lunch counters or buses or drinking fountains. It was something far more profound. King realized this and articulated this, but publicly articulated this perhaps more forcefully after the Searing Watts riots of 1965. Up until then, the most dramatic and most violent racial uprisings in the U.S. history. He realized that the gains against legal segregation had benefited mostly those living in the South, but did nothing for those consigned for the ghettos in the North. It was then that King distinguished between two phases of the civil rights movement. He distinguished between the first phase, which was a struggle for decency, and a second phase, which he called a struggle for equality. And he articulated this very often, but most trenchantly, I believe, in a speech that he gave only twice in his career, in 1967 and then again in 1968, both in the North, one in Stanford, California, and the other in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. It was called The Other America. And in this speech, which incidentally received a very violent reception in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, he said there are literally two Americas. One, he said, is an America overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. Milk and honey, great Baptist preacher. But then he said there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness, characterized by fatigue of despair, with work-starved people living in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums, an arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams, an America characterized by a multiracial, multi-ethnic population of the poor and the impoverished. He rearticulated in this speech that the goal of the civil rights movement was to make these two Americas one America, but he also realized that the America that was united behind a struggle for decency, that is, to rid America of the daily badges of racial humiliation, that America, that goal, that America, that coalition was not necessarily going to be behind a struggle for equality. Because as he said, it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. Although if you were living now, he'd probably have to qualify that one a little bit. It's much easier to integrate a public park than to make genuine quality integrated education a reality. And so today we are struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. And yet he said at the end of his life, it's here where we have a problem. Because most Americans were committed to decency, not equality. For them, the civil rights movement meant we want to struggle for improvement, but not genuine transformation. And that has been the problem in King's life, and it is the problem now as we live in the era of the dream deferred. And this is where the realm of faith comes in. King would argue, and I think his analysis is still correct now, that the greatest challenge facing us in this struggle for equality is a deficit of compassion. A deficit of compassion. That we do not see each other as genuinely equal because we do not see the pain of the other. We're immobilized or anesthetized to it. Yes, we need new programs. We need new public policies, absolutely. But we've changed public policy, and look at where we are. Because as King said and realized, we need to change the soul of America, and that language, I guess, in this kind of post-Enlightenment moment is language that kind of falls on deaf ears. But if you don't redeem the soul, if you don't challenge the underlying ethos, the sickness, then it simply finds new ways of expression. So being the Catholic priest on the panel, I thought it would be good to end with Pope Francis. Yeah, you all like him. He's cool, as my students would say. In his latest apostolic exhortation, he summons us to a new faith-based struggle for equality. He says, speaking of the fact that we need greater justice and inclusion in the world, he says, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume economic growth encouraged by the free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness. This opinion, he continues, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. To sustain a lifestyle which excludes others, or to sustain enthusiasm for that selfish ideal, a globalization of indifference has developed. Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain, feeling a need to help them, as though this was someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. King realized that if we were going to redeem the soul of America, it needed to be a faith-based movement, not faith-based in terms of sectarian movement, but faith meaning being rooted in something that's bigger and larger and truer than we are. And I would submit, as the resident preacher on the panel, that unless we recover that sense of being rooted in something deeper and truer and bigger than we are, then we will continue to live in an era that is a dream deferred, if not crushed.
Grant Silva.
Is this working fine? Okay, as the resident philosopher on the panel, I will speak about morality and freedom. Let me frame this set of comments with the following idea, though. It's the nature of this dream that we're talking about to be deferred. It's the nature of this dream to be deferred. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a second. So the 1963 March on Washington was for jobs and freedom. Really important to keep in mind. Oftentimes, I like when I'm dealing with immigrant communities to remind them of the standard Marxist critique of formal citizenship, of formal equality. Oftentimes, the granting of formal equality allows for the perpetuation and flourishing of various kinds of inequality, for instance, economic inequality. And I think we've seen some of that talked about already. Second, in his famous dream speech and in other places, King employs a intersubjective understanding of freedom, right? He's really clear that the freedom of whites is connected to the freedom of non-whites, right? And progress on one front entails progress on the other, and any shortfall on one front entails a shortfall on the other. And I think we've also seen some people talk about that. This interconnectedness is important, and I'll come back to this in a second. But King tells us in this really fantastic passage, right? He says, it's not till the sons and daughters of slaves and the sons and daughters of slave owners that they can sit together at the table of brotherhood or the table of humanity that freedom can ring. It's really important to keep in mind, I think. Now, in addition to that, King is a moral beacon in what seems to be a long, dark, racist night. But the moral or ethical ideals that he offers aren't those of Dr. King. And I don't mean this to put down his contribution to civil rights or moral progress. Because the moral and ethical ideals that King speaks about are those of the United States, those that you find in the Declaration of Independence, those you find in the Constitution, those you find in the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And King's really clear. He says that his dream is deeply rooted, and I like this idea of rootedness, it's deeply rooted in the American dream. That makes King a radical in the traditional sense of the term radical. He's going to the source for this dream. This is the check, so to speak, that the United States has bounced. Now, by this, I just mean to remind us that King represents the prophetic tradition, which is a point that a lot of people often like to make, okay? Oftentimes, when we hear the word prophet, we think about the future. We think of prophecy. We think of Nostradamus and tarot cards, right? Prophets don't predict, they remind. They tell us we've diverted, we've left the path that we're supposed to be on. We've departed from that path that God has set for us as the chosen people. The prophets in the Old Testament spoke towards the Israelites like this. We veered from that path, and we must return to that path. That's what King does in his dream speech. He reminds us. He calls us of our moral, he calls us towards our moral obligations that we have had from the onset. Okay, so I don't mean to take away from King and his contribution, but I want to just situate him in the correct light that I think we should understand him. So let's remember the path Dr. King directed us towards, right? The path he's trying to put us back on. Now, this is an important point because oftentimes people think we would not have the moral outlook that we've obtained today. We would not appreciate the election and re-election of someone like President Obama had it not been for the moral progress that history has afforded us. Had it not been for the lynching, segregation, slavery, we wouldn't appreciate Obama's presidency in its truest, magnificent light had it not been for this history. We render these grotesque actions necessary. We perform a kind of theodicy towards these actions when we say, thank God we went through all of this horrendous crap, because now we can really appreciate, look at how important Obama is. If we misread King's contributions and his prophetic voice, if we fail to hear it in the way it's supposed to sound to us, we're led with this kind of interpretation, where King's not telling us of moral progress, he's reminding us of our moral mission. And I think that's of the utmost importance and something we have to keep in mind. Now, if we view King's dream as a set or laundry list of goals that's to be achieved, if we see it as something we could check off, then I think we're bound to have the kind of interpretation of Langston Hughes' dream deferred that provides us with a negative outlook on the current situation, right? If we think liberty is something that we could just check off, right? Thank God we've achieved formal equality, we're going to be let down. And this dream is going to do nothing but decay. We must realize that the dream is not a single goal, but a process that we must continuously work towards. And here I'm going to borrow from the great Latin American philosopher Enrique Dussel, who says, we must do to liberty what certain intellectual groups did to truth. So oftentimes, we don't talk about truth anymore, but we talk about verification, right? So we go from truth in the abstract to verification, which is a practice. Well, let's do the same with liberty. Let's stop thinking about liberty as this ideal, and let's talk about liberation, an ongoing practice, a goal that we may never achieve, but we must continually work towards. Now, at times, this may be at odds with King's crisis time, the employment of now, the need for urgency, which I'm willing to agree with in every sense with Dr. King. We can't allow people to tell us, wait, your time will come. Because again, I think that harks back to this theodicy that I want to avoid. However, the great Cesar Chavez had this really interesting saying, tenemos más tiempo que vida, right? Tenemos más tiempo que vida. We have more time than life. Meaning, the goal of liberation, the practice of liberation, might exceed your lifetime. You have to be willing to accept that. Now, this doesn't say let's put off change for the future, but it gives us a realistic attitude about what's going to be the case and how long this is going to take, right? It's going to be very difficult to change from the ground up the historical trajectory that we've been set on. Now, along these lines, I think in order for this liberatory praxis to become possible, we need to we need to jump over a few hurdles. And these represent my personal views. I think some of them have been expressed already, but we can come back to them later. The first is the association made oftentimes between whites and non-whites alike, the association that whiteness and knowledge are hand in hand. I think in order to get the kind of development or moral outlook that's important that Dr. King had in mind, we need to break that equation in the sense that we can't see people who are getting an education that come from impoverished or from non-white backgrounds as selling out when they enter the university or college or some sort of some other endeavor that's improving their lives. Oftentimes, whites and non-whites associate success with a kind of selling out in racial terms that I think we need to get past, and that's difficult. Second, I think we need to get past the sort of atomistic ethic of personal responsibility that focuses one's actions or intents in such a way that exculpates them from the racist history that they live in. So for instance, I'll put it in personal terms. I didn't invent patriarchy. I didn't invent sexism. But I have benefited by a history of patriarchy and male privilege. I may not personally objectify any woman, although my fiance will probably disagree with that. I may not single-handedly oppress any woman, but I know that my existence as male entails a kind of privilege. Now, I can say, well, I didn't invent male privilege, so I'm not responsible for it. But that elides the situation. And I think we've inherited an ethical outlook of personal responsibility, the sort of racist intent, the malice, the ill will in the heart, that makes it impossible for us to see the systematic, sort of widespread sociological, historical point, that we inherit these trajectories that are, for the most part, not our doing, but we nonetheless gain in some way by them. So I think we need to rethink the nature of responsibility. Last, I think we need to rethink the way in which citizenship, right, in two senses of this term, remain a site that preserves white supremacy and privilege, okay? When one can shoot first and ask questions later and feel like they're a good citizen, right? When one can assume that the price of stealing a can of beer is strangulation, right? West Dallas, think Corey Stingley. When blackness is associated with criminality and being Hispanic illegality, right? I think this dream has been deferred. So that nature of citizenship, where one is doing a good deed, one is upholding justice, but employing racism at the same time, needs to be rethought. The other sense in which citizenship remains a site that preserves white supremacy and privilege is in the immigration debate, right? I don't think we would have such an issue with undocumented illegal immigration if had there not been a racial issue, a racist dimension to this. I think that's very apparent in light of the history of the term illegal, but I also think if you close your eyes and imagine the face of illegality, you cannot help but be afforded a racial perspective. So I'll leave it at that since we're kind of over time. Thank you.
Well, my head hurts a little bit because that was heady stuff. I think what I'd like to do is open this up for questions, but maybe even before we begin to take any questions that you might have, I want to give the the panel the opportunity to question each other or go back to certain points that you might have heard one another talk about. And I'll kind of kick that off because I really am kind of interested, given the nature of the work that I do here at Marquette, the implications of the things that all of you have said for what we are trying to do at this university and across all post-secondary opportunities, especially, here in this city. I'd like to just open it up and see if any of you have comments on that. Should have known it was coming.
You want to go first? I'm more willing to defer to you. No.
You say the same things you always do.
Well, I know. That's why I want you to go on record first, so they get mad at you first. There are so many different implications that I don't even know where to begin and how to keep it short and sweet, and so I don't monopolize the time. Let's start with the obvious. If we are indeed being Marquette University, living in an area which is the most segregated metropolitan area in the United States, with the kind of incarceration rates of African American males you pointed out, with the kinds of, gross overlap between race and poverty in this area, how does that change or affect the mission of Marquette University? And I honestly don't know if we have a good answer to that question. I think that we invoke our Catholic Jesuit identity. Basically, we hear about it in response to gender controversies or whatever. But how does it really affect how we do business at Marquette? I dare say you can walk this campus during any time of the change of classes, and you can't help but be struck. I showed a similar chart of the census tract or whatever, where it's color-coded in terms of the racial dynamics. And there's usually, when you look at the racial dynamics, my students looked at the map and they could pick out exactly where Marquette University was. We're this island of whiteness surrounded by the south to the Hispanics and to the north by the African Americans, and then you have this enclave, which is us. And so if we're going to talk about the dream deferred, I would just leave it at that and say that image should haunt us. And if it doesn't haunt us, then, speaking very bluntly, I wonder how seriously we can take Catholic Jesuit identity. I'll just leave it right there.
I really actually want to hear from you guys, but I'll just say very briefly, first, I always agree with most everything Bryan says. But I want to pick up on Grant's comment about dissociating whiteness from knowledge or education. And you addressed it from one perspective. I'll address it from another, where we perpetuate as an institution, first because of our cost, okay, which Marquette faculty get tuition remission because we don't get paid enough to send our kids to this university, most of us. So we're a classist, profoundly classist institution in terms of our economic tuition system. We're also highly classist in terms of the kind of people who want to come to Marquette, the kind of people who Marquette reaches out toward to join us here. And William and Bryan and I have been working on that issue for many years, whether it be student recruitment, faculty recruitment, staff, repositioning of staff into positions of authority. We have lots of staff of color on campus, and of course they're all making minimum wage. And I think that dissociating whiteness, as Grant says, from knowledge or education has to be something that those of us who are in positions of privilege being at this institution really have to take on as part of our Jesuit mission, moral responsibility to start to break that. And I don't, there's many different ways to do it, but the more help you guys can come up with and the more agitation you can have for the faculty who've been, doing various things and many others on campus, we need your help with that.
I'll say something about this, but I'll preface this by reminding you I'm a non-tenured assistant professor, so I'm going to be cautious.
We'll cover you.
So, and I'll try to be a bit more optimistic, built, not to consider you pessimistic, but realistic.
No. You can write down what you want to say, and I'll read it for you.
Okay.
I'm a
But-
good professor. I can't do anything to me.
Built into the fabric of this institution is our mission and an opportunity to address these issues. The fact that the Jesuits place their universities in urban areas means we have a special opportunity to address these, and I am grateful for that. I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy to be a philosopher who can talk about these issues rather than just talk about truth and goodness all day. So I see us uniquely situated in a place where we can actually take part in this, in answering this question. We can try to answer this question collectively. We can live out the ideal that has been set forth. And this is what I think King had in mind as well in his dream speech. This is why I said it's the nature of this dream to be deferred. That dream, those goals that King reminds us of, have been set since the Declaration of Independence, but they've been continuously deferred, continuously ignored, and to a certain extent they remain ignored today. In that sense, bringing this home, for us not to ignore this question, not turn away from it, and appreciate the chance we have to actually do something about it, I'm grateful for that. So. Please remember that during my tenure review as well.
Do you have questions of each other?
I mean, we can talk all the time. I want to hear what they
Okay, just giving you the opportunity. Let's open it up to the, yes.
I find as throughout, I had the privilege of going to a Jesuit undergrad, and now I'm here for graduate school, and I'm always, all of these talks, or I'm so passionate about these topics, and dealing with diversity and how we do all of these things. But I find that my passion, my agitation is almost a roadblock, because whenever I bring my agitation to someone who opposes my view, it becomes an obstacle. now it's an argument as opposed to a discussion. And I'm still trying to learn the right words and the right tools, and I was wondering your opinion on how to do that, how to start having those conversations and start developing the relationships that are going to get us where we need to go, that are going to kind of keep working toward these goals that we've been, that have been put off for so long. I don't want to become one of those hardened people that says, well, I beat it. I beat the glass ceiling, so now I'm not going to reach down and help. How does that work? How do we do that? Or start doing that?
Well, I think, the most powerful tool any of us has is education and knowledge. And I don't mean being privileged by education. I mean taking responsibility to learn what you know you don't know, taking responsibility to cross lines that might make you feel uncomfortable, to stand up against racism or sexism or homophobia when you see it. And I try to teach my undergrads the tools through which to do that really are rooted in knowledge. I mean, you have to know history. You have to know what's come before. You have to know where we are now, realistically, not what Fox News says where we are now, right? I mean, the flow of information most undergrads get, I've learned, is like Twitter and Facebook. I mean, I don't even do those things just because that's how old I am, but anyway. But so you're part of the problem is that you're trying to engage people in a conversation when you're talking to a vacuum, in terms of a vacuum of knowledge. And I think the best tool I can suggest, or I have, is knowing the truths and knowing the history and knowing the facts and being able to reach out, not as a form of argumentation, but as a form of education. Let's learn from each other. How can we make sense of this? If we had more faculty of color, if all of the Africana faculty were not in this room, there's a few who are missing, but they're at job talks, we would actually have more courses in the Africana Studies program, among others, that would allow us to teach these kinds of materials more broadly. But each of us is teaching survey classes in whatever our disciplines are, and then we get to do what we really like to do. That doesn't help you solve the problem, but it does say you can probably sit in on any of our classes, should you like to, right?
I would just add to that, and I think this actually gets back to the last question as well, is I think that also really requires a full-throated defense and also a real sort of articulation of the power and the purpose of a liberal arts education, especially at this time where so many undergraduates as well are sort of trying to be pushed into professional development. These 4 years you have here are really special in the chance of really being able to acquire sort of broad-based knowledge that will help you develop a love of learning, and then ultimately can sort of trickle out into hopefully having more informed conversations. And I think fundamentally that is in many respects something that this and other schools should be pushing towards, is actually instead of sort of trying to push students into these narrow fields with very limited education outside of a sort of specialty, to instead be going in the exact opposite direction. And not just for helping to create a greater and sort of enlightened populace. I mean, it's actually sort of, I often tell my students on the first day of a history class, I rattle off all the sort of statistics that, and also the sort of actual words of people in the business community who say that they actually prefer people who come out onto the job market with a major like history or English or philosophy than a sort of narrowly tailored specialty. I think it really puts you on a much more firm footing, both in sort of on a personal and also sort of on a broader level. And I would hope that Marquette and other schools would sort of kind of appreciate that a little bit more. So,
just in response to the question, one of the points I was trying to make is dropping the ideal of liberty and appreciating the praxis of liberation, right? So we may get to these plateaus, but we have to continue to search for those sites of oppression that are taking place, right? So even though we may get past these hurdles, there are still other hurdles out there. As humans, we are imperfect, right? So there's always going to be problems. The other thing is I think you have to appreciate the argument that you'll get into. And if I heard your question correctly, it's about the way in which passion can sometimes get in the way of argumentation. Now, I'm a philosopher. I love arguments, okay? I appreciate arguments because you at least have an opportunity to engage in discussion, some kind of discussion, with the other side. The thing you have to be willing to do is really listen, right? Like, I'm, pro-immigrant, but I understand the argument that those who are afraid of immigration make. They see their personal existence as being challenged by these people who are forsaking federal immigration policy. They really see themselves as threatened in some way. And I almost want to say, look, we're going to hold hands and we're going to get through this together, right? But you have to be willing to listen to that other person's perspective. That's a good thing. Where I went to graduate school in Eugene, Oregon, everyone was liberal. Everyone was on the right side of every political question, and there was no debate. It was like being in heaven or something like that, right? It's like they're so boring. You're never going to get any discussion. So I think you have to appreciate the other perspective and really listen if you want to get the kind of dialogue you have in mind. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Probably disagree a little bit. This is all too nice. And we want to find dialogue and we want to find the right words or whatever. Social change is messy and it's strident. And Martin Luther King we want to deify him as if he's this kind of hyper-rational person that when he spoke, everyone agreed with him. Absolutely not, okay? We honor King now far more than when he was alive, okay? The people that thought he was the most dangerous American, thought that he was anti-American because of what he said. And so I think sometimes, I understand pedagogically what you're saying, because in the classroom, I do that, okay? In the classroom, I presume that the person who is saying something that's completely off the wall and crazy is, I want to honor that opinion and nurture that opinion and hopefully lead them from one place to another. Pedagogically, that works. But in doing social change, there not only is room for stridency, it is absolutely essential. Because you're trying to break through a narrative of a habit of rhetoric which deliberately marginalizes that rhetoric or that discourse which would try to unseat it. Social change is conflictual. The March on Washington that we're talking about now wasn't uniformly greeted with open arms. Absolutely not. People thought about this in a metaphor of invasion. And they had the National Guard, and it received wall-to-wall coverage because they thought you can't have 250,000 black people in one area without the whole thing being blown up. So I think it's important. There would be multiple strategies. One is a strategy of pedagogy and dialogue and trying to come to mutual agreement or whatever. But there also needs to be another strategy that understands that social change doesn't happen without conflict. And it's going to be messy. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, and our Marquette students you guys are all really nice, right? Everyone's really nice, especially the women. We won't get into a sexist commentary now, but stridency does have its place. I think stridency with facts is what are gonna win. But the other side, whatever the other side is to you, is no doubt being just as strident from their perspective as you have a right to be on yours. And politeness is a good thing, but it's also underrated, as most people who know me know. I tend to
up in the South. There are people who are very polite. Southerners are very polite. How are you, ma'am? Thank you, ma'am. Nice to see you, ma'am. But what that really means is cold what's there. So right. Politeness gets you. There's that other flip side of it that we see.
I just want to say a couple things. One is bringing it back to our Jesuit higher educational mission. I agree with pretty much what everybody said, but I think that deep listening that you were talking about is an art, it's a discipline. That our higher education system is really founded also on honoring the interior life. So it's paying attention to what's going on outside, and then social action and change comes from that movement of the heart, which requires conversion, which requires relationship, which is what I'm getting to. So when you said, I think it was you, Bryan, who talked about decency versus equality, I thought immediately, Bryan, William, Susanna, like my other people on different boards, that to me immediately said Marquette. Like where we get stuck with all of the topics, decency versus equality, because that next level of connection and relationship and deep moral courage to get to equality is different from the stuff that we spend a lot of time talking about. So this was very rich.
And linking equality to money, right? What we were always told at this institution, why we cannot do certain things we want to in terms of diversity initiatives, is because we can't afford it. Okay, that's a conflation of it right there. It depends on where you really want to place your priorities and how you're going to allocate scarce resources. It's always been that way, and we fail as an institution horribly in that regard.
Oh, yes. I guess sort of building off the point you made, or I guess a few points that you made, but I want sort of quote that was Martin Luther King did not make the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement made Martin Luther King. And I think we shouldn't really, I guess, just sort of off the idea of not romanticizing about a single figure, sort of deifying someone. It's also, there's a functioning of power there from the standpoint that the points that are highlighted are often just the sort of segregation. There's obviously, I'm really glad all of it was brought up in terms of economics and that sort of, that side of the movement, that interconnectedness with racism. But I guess my question is, do you think that the day, Martin Luther King Day, is necessary, or should it be more of a collective sort of day, just sort of honoring the civil rights movement versus just deifying someone and sort of, I guess in avoiding other issues, because you also saw that with Mandela right after he died. There was just the talk of the anti-apartheid, and there was nothing about economics or anything that would really challenge the sort of current paradigm.
I think you should answer that, and then Will should answer. I heard Bryan and Will on NPR yesterday morning discussing this issue. So.
I know, and they made it seem like we were opposed because they only took 2 sentences on my 15 minutes. And when I listened to what you said, I said that too. But when,
I had the same reaction.
yeah, I know. I mean, and so yeah, I came up saying, yeah, the day of service is wonderful. And you were like saying it's horrible. I'm like saying, wait a minute. But anyway, yeah, I think about Martin Luther King the way I think about Black History Month. You know, it's like, okay, we got a month. That's nice. But no, seriously, I think that. What's his name? Is it? I get his first name right. James Harding has the book called An Inconvenient Hero, and he begins by saying that dead people make convenient heroes, and that's part of the tension with the King Day holiday. One is to realize that the King Day holiday has always been controversial. Always been. I mean, it was a struggle to get the holiday precisely because as much as we try to tame King, it can't really be done. And the King holiday reminds us, despite the kind of nice rhetoric we put around it and everything, of some really awful things that happened in the past that are still going on today. And so the holiday has the potential to be very subversive and messy, which is why it's always controversial, why it's something that is, I mean, when we look at it now, it's something that it's for black people. People come to me and say, Happy King Day, as if it's supposed to be, well, okay, well, it's a national holiday, but we don't think of it that way. And I think we don't think of it that way for good reasons. And so I'm not against I agree with you that it shouldn't just be a day, okay? Absolutely not. It should be, as you said, it's supposed to be about rekindling a movement, of course. But given the kinds of people that we are, I think there's a place for anniversaries and for times of systemic remembrance. Not as ends in themselves, like you don't remember your wedding anniversary as an end in itself. But it's an anniversary that reminds us of what's supposed to be an ongoing thing and to lift up. Because frankly, if it weren't for the kind of King Day holiday, we wouldn't have this panel. Now, this panel is not an end in itself. It's a moment of, at its best, of interruption, where we call our attention to things that we all know, but we need those reminders. To use the language of my faith tradition, it's a sacramental moment where it makes visible an invisible reality. So no, I agree with you. It's not sufficient, and as much as Black History Month isn't sufficient, but I think it's important, especially given the ways in which we use, the ways in which we try to domesticate memory, to at least have some place where you have an entree for subversion.
But we're also domesticating the holiday, because what these two were commenting on that NPR was asking about was, is a day of service a great idea? So, you know, if you could get certain representations of Martin Luther King Day and you think it's all about community service and has nothing to do with race whatsoever. So I will bite back a little bit and say I think it's, you know, I think we run the same risk of deifying the holiday or sentimentalizing it in the same way that we have of King himself. We need that radical impulse to not feel good because you went and worked at a soup kitchen. The Obamas are not helping us with that. I mean, they're doing their best, but.
Well, this is my concern with the idea of day of service. What other social institution where, you know, exists where you work for someone else? Slavery, right? It's a day of service for someone else. That's a definition of slavery. So that rubs me. It hits some moral intuition. It hits something. I don't know if it's a moral intuition. It's hitting something. This doesn't work for me. I like interruption. I'm not saying go do something for someone, okay? Please do. But to turn this day, in light of our history, into a work for someone else day, I don't.
Well, and
You get what I'm saying? Yeah?
And the flip side is work for someone who's of lesser means than you, right? That's how it's. So you know, you respond one way, but flip it over. It's still about economics. It's still about, you know, inequality fundamentally, no matter how we slice it.
Heather, I wondered this, and William and I talked about this morning, given that we can remember before it was a holiday. And the whole controversy around making it a holiday, and I've spent all my career in higher education, and universities who did not want to give it as a holiday would say, we'll use this as service. We will do in-service for school teachers. They can come in and we will do that, as opposed to really, it was, if you go back before universities or states implemented it as a holiday, and not everybody did it first. It was a service day. It was before that, and I spent 13 years at University of Iowa, and they were doing service before it was in other places to do that. And I think Arizona was one of the last places, and I was told that they did service, how they compensated for not doing it. Universities engaged in service. So to say that you're not really, that you are committed.
Yeah, I think though that we have to also kind of, you know, not going to be a big defender of service. I agree with all that, but what other national holiday do we tell people to get out of themselves?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Okay, really, seriously, what other holiday do we tell people to get out of themselves? Now, I'm not saying that that's the end-all or be-all, but there is, from the beginning, there is a recognition that there's something different about this holiday. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been so controversial. And again, I don't want to put service out there as a panacea. It's not. But at least it gives us the entree for another kind of conversation. And in that way, I'm put it this way, to reduce to some of the absurd, I'm far more comfortable with King's holiday being a day of service than what really incenses me is when I pick up a paper and I see something for a King Day sale. I mean, that to me is, talk about antithetical. I mean, it's just so incongruous. And the fact that many don't even interrogate that is even more problematic. So that's for what it's worth.
I know Janet wants to stop. Oh, I'm sorry. No, maybe she doesn't. Who's been here more than 20 years? Help me, somebody out there. Okay, am I correct in thinking that when King Day was first turned into a holiday, we did not take it off, and it was only... So at first, our institution didn't, it was a national holiday, but we still had school. That did change, but we're implicated.
You know what they did? You got short. They gave you King Day, but you used to have an extra day for New Year.
Exactly.
They took away. University
Exactly.
never
They
did
moved it.
an extra
We had the
day.
same number of days, they
took
just
a
moved
day
it.
away. If you go back and look at any university calendar, people lost the day. I can only speak about higher education, but you lost the day. And I think that day was on, you would get January 1st and the 2nd. That's where that day came from, but you got it. So
Yeah, I'm still not sure how I feel about not having class on King Day.
Especially as Africana Studies faculty.
Well, no, I think that we see it not only as a day of service, but also a day of leisure, it's another day off, and it's a 3-day weekend. Whereas I think in the beginning, because I remember when we did not have off, and there were things, there were activities that were going on. It was like a sanctioned teach-in. And where we could be deliberately, where you wouldn't have a panel like this, as a one-shot thing on a Friday, but you would have a whole day in which you really had to be attentive to what was going on. And I think we've lost something, frankly, by moving it to just a 3-day holiday kind of thing. So that's just for what it's
It's a
worth.
good idea for next year, Brian.
Well,
Martin Luther King Day teach-in.
We'll do the one more question, and yeah.
I just have to jump in here. I'm from the local women's college across the way there, Mount Mary University, and
Speak a little louder, please.
yes, I'm a Spelman alum, and had an opportunity to march to make Martin Luther King a holiday, marching down Auburn Avenue. And what I miss the most of living in this part of the country is that the inactivity of people making the holiday, making it real. And I so wish during this time that I was in Atlanta with my friends, with my colleagues, the week that we would spend recognizing, having panels, looking at footage. Coretta Scott King was adamant that no freshman class would come to the Atlanta University Center without understanding, doing a King teach-in with us. And it was just, the energy was just there. What I worry about is, yes, yesterday was a day off. At my institution, nothing was said about it. And so today, of course, in my class, when we talked about faith and community and, what did the King holiday have to do with us being people of faith in our community? So the ripple effect is dying, in terms of what this day is about and what opportunities are there for us.
Well, I think on that note, I'm glad you ended us with that comment, because I do think we actually, sometimes with panels, you wonder, we say, I hear wonderful things. Like I said, my head was starting to hurt with the wonderful ideas I was hearing. But sometimes you walk away thinking, well, do we have a specific plan of action on something that we can do? And maybe we should commit ourselves to that teach-in idea next year. I think that would be a wonderful thing for us to do, is to open the doors of the university, perhaps even think about opening the doors of the university to people who are not connected to the university.
Great idea. Yeah.
So let's think about that for next year and start planning now. I just want to thank this panel. I want to thank Heather Hathaway, Andrew Kahrl, Bryan Massingale, Grant Silva. Wonderful job. But I also want to thank Raynor Memorial Library for co-sponsoring this, especially Emily Laws and Janice Welburn for organizing this afternoon's panel. They did the work. So please enjoy our reception, and don't go away, because at 6 o'clock we've got on stage Dr. William Jones, the main event. That's right. That's right. Okay. Thank you all.